you good with the Spencer plan?
I'm just getting the update right now.
Okay.
So you guys will Q&A. Spencer, you do a little cast or just Q&A?
Just Q&A. Just climate chat. All
Just
stuff.
remember, climate is what you expect, weather is what you get.
That's it.
And which famous American author is that attributed to?
Oh, I don't know who said that.
Mark Twain.
Was it Twain again?
Hmm. So Spencer, could you speak to the main methane emitters, like from the oil and oil rigs to like cows? Okay, you don't have to go into details because honestly, but I think as we talk about how are we going to achieve that? So Biden set this lofty goal in the U.S. What does that mean? What do we have to cut out? You know, I guess the oil and natural oil exploration, offshore drilling, blah, blah. But Spencer, the oil lobbies in the U.S. are so powerful. Okay. And then with regard to cows, I mean, what can we do about that?
Well, we have researchers here in California working with that already.
Oh, really?
There's a group that,
Okay. Okay, I'm going to let you think and not talk to you for a few minutes.
Okay, I'll be talking about this level. There's a researcher at UC Merced.
Hey.
Yes.
You know what? I actually don't see how Schiff being at 3:05 is good for us. We take him for 5 minutes till 3:10. I mean, I have at least a 10-minute conversation planned with him. What, 10 minutes till 3:15? You mean a super long A block? All right. I think at some point we may have to say too late for Schiff, you know? Yeah. Right? I mean, it just depends. I mean, he says 3:05, but that can easily be 3:10. It's LA traffic. I mean, should we just start with that? I suggest we just do Gandhi for A and B, short B if Schiff arrives to make for a long C. Right. And then we can do the Spencer thing at the end if we have extra time, or the Oceana person. But let's just start with Gandhi, okay? She's available now, so.
All right, 1 minute out. We are loading up Gandhi right now.
Thank you, Spencer, for being flexible.
building a better Bay Area. Moving forward, finding solutions. This is ABC7 News.
All right, I'm Kristen Z. Thank you for watching Getting Answers live on ABC7, Hulu Live, and wherever you stream. We ask experts your questions every day at 3 to get answers for you in real time. Today, we'll talk to Representative and Chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Adam Schiff. A lot to talk about with him, the races going on around the country and the continuation of the investigation into the January 6th insurrection. But first, CDC advisors are now recommending Pfizer's COVID-19 vaccine for children ages 5 to 11 years old. That news just coming down in the past hour. And with that as backdrop, one local doctor has co-authored a petition urging doctors to sign it and together urge the California Department of Public Health to make a clear way out, of masking, quarantines, and asymptomatic testing in schools. Joining us now is UCSF infectious disease specialist, Dr. Monica Gandhi. Dr. Gandhi, good to see you.
Good to see you.
Before we get to the 5 to 11-year-olds getting the Pfizer vaccine with that approval, I want to ask you about this because you patiently explained all along your thinking and choices as they've evolved over the course of the pandemic, right? Making adjustments each time something meaningful happens, like vaccines becoming widespread, the Delta surge, Delta goes away, kids getting approved for vaccines, etc. Now, this week, I noticed you seem to be taking a strong stand, now saying California health officials have got to establish a way out of those mitigation measures, including masking in schools. Why?
Yes, so I strongly support the 5 to 11-year-old vaccine. I wrote a piece this morning in the Chronicle explaining all the reasons why I think people should get their children vaccinated. However, Bay Area officials have decided to have metrics for when adults can unmask. And we're going to go up and down with the transmission because the way the CDC defines it, it's hard to be in the low tier. It's just a complicated way how they define it. So the rule is that 8 weeks after the children vaccine is available, then adults can stop masking inside. And that got declared by San Francisco health officials. So that's true of adults, and they're all in bars and restaurants and 19,000 people in Chase, and everyone's unmasked or going to be unmasked in 8 weeks. But children, there's no off-ramp or metrics for when they would go back to normal life. And then the important thing about this meeting today, the CDC ACIP meeting, is there's a lot of mental illness developing in children from all the school closures and lack of normalcy. So they deserve normalcy like adults do as well.
All right, so, you talk about the mental health impact, but what are some of the other downsides you see to not having the off-ramps in schools, right? Not knowing when you can stop masking, not knowing when you can stop asymptomatic testing or quarantining every time there's a case. Like, what does that do in terms of either the education standpoint or the standpoint of encouraging vaccinations?
Yes, I think there's two things that it does. In terms of encouraging vaccinations, I don't think it encourages people to vaccinate their children when they get to go back to normal and their children don't, when only 27% of parents around the country are saying definitively going to vaccinate their child. So this is called positive motivation. And I think we'd get more people vaccinated if we said, yes, your child gets to go back to normal. Second is quarantines are keeping children out of school. We wrote a piece about that in the Washington Post. It's kind of the new school closure for 2021 for blue states because they're keeping children out of quarantine longer, 10 to 14 days, if they don't do test to stay, getting a test and letting them stay in school every day. And then finally, a mask. And there was this NPR interview with all these kids who were masking, and they said, it reminds me that we're in a pandemic. It reminds me that I'm scared. And, there are implications for children of all this long, prolonged period of not being normal. If we can define them for adults, we can define off-ramps for kids. All
right. Look, you talk about not having the off-ramps kind of undermining the vaccination effort, which you're really pushing right now as the CDC has approved it. Why is that even a concern, the undermining, when the vaccine will be mandated in a few months anyway for school entry, at least here in California?
Well, probably it won't be mandated until it's fully approved. And that is going to take longer than a few months because if the authorization came today, usually it's 6 months between authorization and approval. Mm-hmm. Beyond that, I'm worried that who won't get their child vaccinated, even if there's a mandate. Traditionally, there's been more racial, I think, minorities who have been more reluctant about the vaccines, given our long history of mistrust in this country. This will keep an equitable distribution of those who can go to school and those who can't. And some parents need some more time to look at the safety of the vaccines. I feel very assured by them. I wrote them all down, all these reasons in the Chronicle today. But there are some parents who need a little more time. Talk to their pediatrician, really think about it. And we can't, it would be really positive motivator. There are many who are saying, hey, as soon as I tell my child gets to go back to normal, I'll vaccinate them. If we don't link vaccines in a country that's hesitant about vaccines, at least this vaccine, to normalcy, we've just told the blue states, at least, that your life will never change, but take the vaccine.
Okay. I also wonder if this means that you don't agree with schools that come out and say, look, if you don't get the vaccine, like Oakland Unified has said this, then your choices are to unenroll or you have to go to a special independent study school. What do you think about that approach?
So I think that approach is, okay when the vaccine's fully approved. It is not actually fully approved for either 12 to 15-year-olds or 5 to 11-year-olds. And the reason it's not fully approved is we have data on a relatively small number of children. And the FDA said they're going to have an army of safety experts looking at these vaccines. I'm sure they're safe, but some people need that final stamp of approval before you can mandate. So the only way that President Biden could mandate the vaccine was after August 23rd, which is when it got fully approved. So I don't think you can, or maybe you can, but it doesn't seem that's usually how we do mandates in this country. And importantly, again, it's good to do positive incentivizing motivation first, I think, before you impose mandates.
Okay. Look, you also wrote, as part of that letter, that petition urging California public health officials to set metrics for when they can end masking in schools, which they have not said yet, but hopefully they'll establish the metrics soon, if not the date. You said high quality education experiences, you kind of link it to being allowed to, quote, see each other's faces and return to full linguistic and emotional engagement. What does that mean?
Well, there was an article in the New York Times this weekend about that we have to talk about off-ramps for masking in schools. And there was a number of pediatricians who were interviewed that said, we don't know the impact on language development. It's intellectually dishonest to discuss masking as if it's completely normal. It's not. We've done it now for a year and a half and counting. And for young children, forming speech, they may need to see people's faces. And beyond that, the mental health effects have been really difficult this pandemic, more on young people than us as adults, probably because their routines are more based on socialization. And because of that, socialization usually involves, the full range of facial expressions.
Do you feel like in general, California has gone overboard in our reaction? You also tweeted that we were 50 out of 50 in terms of states, in terms of, kids losing time in school, classroom time over the pandemic. What do you think?
Well, we just are. So the Burbio website keeps track of school closures, and we kept children out of in-person learning more days than any of the 50 states. So we are truly 50 out of 50 of keeping public school students out of in-person learning. Right above us is Oregon, and then Maryland and Virginia were pretty close.
But was that necessary and worked to our good in terms of keeping our kids safe and healthy? Or do you think they could have accomplished the same goals without having taken that many school days away?
They could have accomplished those goals without taking that many school days away. There was study after study in New York, in Utah, in Wisconsin, in Georgia that showed the safety of in-person learning with mitigation procedures in place, even at the height of the pandemic with really high community transmission. Many states just made it happen. They had their children back in in-person learning, and we didn't in California. And I think we can't ever call that a success of our state's pandemic response.
All right. Dr. Monica Gandhi, don't go away because we have so much more to talk about, including why you think the CDC's definition of community transmission is outdated and why we should start thinking about cases, numbers may not necessarily mean we are in horrible shape. Counterintuitive, but a lot to dissect there, so don't go away. We'll be right back.
In commercial break.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Monica Gandhi. We thank you for your time to be able to do deep dives into these very important conversations that are not always had with us and our viewers. But right now is your time, viewers. If you have a question for Dr. Gandhi with regard to either kids, getting the shot from 5 to 11-year-olds especially, which just got approved in terms of the emergency use authorization, CDC approval. But Dr. Gandhi, we still need the CDC director sign off, which is expected in the next, few hours? Today?
Yes, it'll definitely happen, I'm sure, today.
Okay. Yeah, so if you have any questions for Dr. Gandhi, please go ahead and ask. I want to ask you what you plan to do, because you, I know, have an 11-year-old, right? You've talked about that. So how quickly will you book an appointment? And then how are you going to handle your appointment in terms of the 2 shots?
So I'm hoping I can get him his first shot as early as the end of this week. My pediatrician has said Saturday, possibly they'll have clinics. And then I will wait 8 weeks to give him his second dose. And that was for 3 reasons. One, immunologic research shows that your T-cell responses, which are your durable responses, are better with longer duration between doses. Second, a Canada study showed that giving 8 weeks between doses made the Pfizer vaccine more effective against preventing disease. And third is there's less myocarditis, at least in older children, with a longer spacing between doses in Canada than there was in Israel, where there was shorter spacing, 3 weeks between doses.
Oh, I see. Okay, so multiple reasons to wait just a little bit longer. So you think 6 weeks is ideal? 8 weeks? Anywhere in between that?
6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
6 to 8 weeks. And I did 7 weeks for my 13-year-old, and I'm going to do 7 weeks for the 11-year-old.
All right. Lauren has a question. She asked, didn't you post on Twitter a while back you withdrew support for the governor's stance for a COVID vaccine mandate for children? Do you still stand by that withdrawal, even though you very much want kids to get vaccinated?
Yes, I very much want children to get vaccinated, but mandate, I think, cannot be imposed without without linking it to some degree of lots of restrictions. We are all losing our masks, children aren't, and that's why I
Thank you.
stopped.
We're coming back on TV, so we'll pause right there. And we are back with infectious disease specialist from UCSF, Dr. Monica Gandhi. A lot to talk about today. Remember, Pfizer's 5 to 11-year-old vaccine just got approved by the CDC. We'll talk more about that and how you should handle it if you have a kid. But Dr. Gandhi, I want to start with, why is the CDC's definition of community transmission, you think, negatively impacting us?
Yes. So the way that community transmission was defined before vaccinations totally made sense. It was based on 2 parameters: test positivity, which you lower, test positivity if you test a lot. Places like San Francisco test a lot, and then the number of cases over 100,000 people. And in the setting of mass asymptomatic testing, which we did before the vaccine, because we wanted to see if we could break chains of transmission, so we test anyone who didn't feel well, anyone who's had exposure, just come and test. You're going somewhere, come and test. There was a lot of testing sites. And that meant that we would really be able to catch people who have cases and know how much cases there are in the community. The CDC, after vaccination, says don't go and test unless you've had an exposure or you don't feel well. And so if you go and test, you're actually very likely to have COVID. And so you have it in your nose. And so your cases over 100,000 people are going to be high just because we're testing the way the CDC tells us to test, which is go and test if you've been exposed to COVID. And so it doesn't tell you the amount of spread in a community. So we're always going to be in a moderate or high or substantial community transmission by that artificial definition.
So what metrics should we use instead, you think?
I think hospitalizations over 100,000 people, we have about, say, 3 people in the hospital over 100,000 people, for example, in the city of San Francisco. Now, in a typical flu season, we'll have something typical. It's been 2 years now, 20 to 40 people in the hospital over 100,000. So we made our metrics much lower because COVID is much more deadly than flu for adults. So we said 5 to 10 people in the hospital over 100,000 people. Hospitalization metrics don't distort. I mean, sometimes they do if you say someone has COVID when they just swab positive and they're there for a broken leg. In general, we do the best we can to say this is a real COVID hospitalization.
So implied in this, I think, is that cases may be okay as long as the people who have the cases don't get sick, as in ill. Would you say that's accurate?
Well, yes. So the reason we tested so much for cases before is because you could spread the virus when you're asymptomatic, even when you feel well. So we tested and tested to make sure we could try to break that chain. After vaccination, you definitely can spread it if you feel ill, but we don't have a lot of evidence that if you feel well that you're spreading it. And in fact, the CDC does not recommend that you test if you're asymptomatic and vaccinated. So it's predicated on the fact that we think we're blocking the virus and killing it in our nose. So we may have a tiny bit in our nose, but we're killing it and we're not spreading it if we're vaccinated. And that makes sense microbiologically.
All right, Dr. Gandhi, the CDC, of course, just approved the Pfizer vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds on an emergency use authorization basis. It is a smaller dose, I think 1/3 the adult dose, right? I want to ask you if you think all parents should get it right away, if they could, talk to them about how safe you think it is.
So I think it's safe for the reason that it's so much less of a dose. So there seems to be a dose response with the rare side effect of myocarditis. And what do I mean by that? Well, the myocarditis is inflammation of the heart, and the Moderna vaccine for 12 to 17-year-olds has not been authorized by the FDA. And in fact, they delayed it because it's 100 micrograms, and they're likely seeing more myocarditis than they're comfortable with in that smaller trial. So they have not approved that. The 30 microgram dose of Pfizer is approved for 12 to 15-year-olds. And even in that case, we do see these rare but mild cases of myocarditis. But it is more common again in Israel, where they were every 3 weeks, than Canada, when they were every 8 weeks, 4 times as common as Israel, which is why I want people to extend the dose. And then the 10 microgram dose is what we're using for 5 to 11-year-olds. That to me makes a lot of sense because the FDA talked to Pfizer. There was this they had in June and said, make it smaller. We can't have any safety concerns when children are so much less at risk. And they listened to them and they made the dose much smaller. So I feel like this is going to be a safe dose.
Okay. And there's nothing in the trials, right, with the thousands of kids or more who have gotten the Pfizer vaccine to suggest it could hurt the kids.
Right. I mean, it was 2,200 kids total and was half and half placebo and 10 micrograms, but no one got myocarditis. No.
All right. Thank you so much, Dr. Monica Gandhi. I appreciate the time you gave us for this in-depth conversation. A lot to think about at this juncture in the pandemic. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
All right. Coming up next, Congressman Adam Schiff of California joining us to talk about elections today and the January 6th insurrection investigation. We'll be right back.
In commercial break.
All right, folks, we're going to let you take a short little break here as I confer with my producer.
Seven, 6, 5 seconds, 4, 3, 2.
Welcome back. It is Election Day with some key races that offer a preview of next year's congressional midterm elections. This as the investigation into the January 6th Capitol insurrection continues. One man who's an integral part of the investigation is chairman of the House Intelligence Committee, Congressman Schiff of California. He has a new book out, Midnight in Washington: How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Congressman Schiff joins us now to talk about the book, the investigation, and the political turmoil in our nation. Congressman Schiff, thanks for joining us. Good to have you back.
Great to be with you. Thank you.
So, let's touch on today's elections really quickly. One of the key ones, Virginia governor's race. Terry McAuliffe, Democrat, in a tight race against Republican Glenn Youngkin. Youngkin was not even very well known, and now he's running neck and neck with the former governor in an increasingly blue state, one that President Biden won handily. I wonder if that worries you as a Democrat. I mean, if you see it as a bellwether for the midterms or a referendum on the president.
I think there's a long tradition of the president in power not doing well in that first Virginia gubernatorial race. I hope we can break that precedent this year. Terry McAuliffe is a great candidate, and I'm keeping my fingers crossed. But we'll find out soon enough. The polls are closing in just a little while. But I'm very optimistic. I think that we have a really important and positive program to run on that we're going to get finished in the next few days, and that will be a great boost. I wish it were earlier in the time for the Virginia governor's race.
You're talking about the Build Back Better bills that, have not gotten a vote. I know President Biden really wanted that before he went off to Europe and the climate summit. I wonder if you think that Democrats are in a weakened position in the sense that you seem very divided between the progressives and the moderates like Joe Manchin and Kristen Sinema, who even now we don't know if Manchin's going to sign on to the infrastructure bill, although the president does seem optimistic. But the Republicans are very united. How do you account for that division within the Democratic Party and the unity in the Republican Party?
Well, in the Democratic Party, we are nearly unanimous in support of lowering prescription drug prices, expanding Medicare to cover vision and dental and hearing, paid family leave, early childhood education, all of these things. The challenge is when you have a 50-50 divided Senate, near unanimity is not enough. You need to be unanimous. And we're getting there. And I think we'll be there within the next week or so. But I wish we had gotten there already by now.
All right. Well, your book is titled Midnight in Washington: How We Almost Lost Our Democracy and Still Could. Now, some people, Congressman, worry that it's already been lost, looking at the polarization from one another and demonization of one another that we see from Washington all the way to local school boards. How do we bring our nation back, you think, from the brink?
It's a really good question. And I wanted to write about that very issue. What has so polarized us and divided us as a country, what it was like to conduct an investigation of a president and try one of the few impeachments in history. And to bring us back as a country, we're going to need, I think, continued leadership that is trying to mend the divide, as Joe Biden is. I think as long as Donald Trump is on the scene and continuing to try to poison some Americans against others, it's going to be very difficult. But I also think neighbor to neighbor, sometimes family member to family member, we need to have those heart-to-heart conversations again that have so broken down after the last several years.
In the book, you also write about how your own life experiences in Eastern Europe prepared you for the rise of Trump in the U.S. How so?
Well, I lived in Czechoslovakia and saw that country divide in two because of a xenophobic populist leader named Vladimir Mečiar. Who blamed the Czechs and blamed the Hungarian-speaking population and blamed the Romani population for the economic woes that Slovaks were feeling. When I arrived, there was no chance of the country dividing, but within a matter of weeks, I saw the power of this kind of xenophobic populism, this ugly nativism, literally tear the country apart. And what I have seen in Trump and Trumpism is a very similar kind of blame the other, blame those that don't look like the white majority, and that kind of ugly rhetoric really does tear countries apart, and I think it's been enormously destructive here as well.
the violence that we saw on January 6th seemed to have given some Republican colleagues of yours pause. But since the immediate aftermath, they seem to have kind of changed their tunes again. So given that, I wonder how confident are you that the January 6th committee that you're a part of will hold those responsible, accountable?
Well, you're absolutely right. Republican members, and I was on the House floor during that insurrection, and I describe in the first chapter of the book what it was like to be there when they were breaking down the doors and breaking the windows to get in. The Republicans were just as terrified as anyone else. I was with a Republican who had basically took a wooden post out of the floor to use as a club to defend himself. But those Republican members are now pushing the same big lie that led to that violence on January 6th, a lie about our elections, that it was rigged or fraudulent, and that just undermines our whole democratic system. Now, on the committee, we're working in a very bipartisan fashion, and we're going to expose all of the misconduct by whoever was responsible in Congress, in the White House, in the cabinet, among these white nationalist groups. We are going to hold hearings, additional hearings. We're doing depositions and interviews almost every day. So the truth will come out.
Look, the investigative work continues, but it seems to have fallen off the radar for many Americans. Do you think there's some sense of responsibility to be borne by the media or social media?
Look, I think that the media has a responsibility not to lose sight of this incredible attack, this tragic attack on our democracy, and the fact that the same falsehoods about our election, which propelled that kind of violence, could lead to other violence again. If you persuade people, as Donald Trump is trying to do, that we can't rely on our elections to decide who should govern, then what is left but violence? And so I do think it's an obligation of those of us in elective office, those in the media and elsewhere, to make sure that people understand what the stakes are and how precious and fragile our democracy really is.
I think the partisanship hurts you greatly, because over your 20 years in Congress, it sounds like you've had friends on the other side of the aisle. But I wonder if you still consider them friends, if you still talk with Representative Nunes or McCarthy or, Senator Mitch McConnell on a friendly basis. Are you friends still?
Devin Nunes, who's my ranking member, he and I continue to work together on the Intelligence Committee and get the work of that committee done. We've really never had an uncivil word towards each other. That doesn't mean we don't have the most vehement disagreements. We do, but we try to keep it within certain bounds. And there are a great many Republican members that I have a good working relationship, even if it doesn't, border on friendship. But nonetheless, I can't help but after that insurrection, after so many people who I, had admired and respected, because I believed that they believed what they were saying, turned out not to believe it and are willing to continue pushing a big lie that undermines our democracy. And it's really, frankly, hard to have a relationship
Congressman
with folks.
Schiff, we'll have to take a short break, but let's continue this conversation on Facebook Live.
In commercial break?
Yeah, I'm sorry to interrupt. We had to pay some bills, and commercial time is pretty firm. But I do want to ask you, if you think it's still possible to be friends with someone whose politics is just so different, I wonder if that can be carried down to the school board level and whether those conversations are still possible. And if you have some tips for how to do it.
Well, yes, it's absolutely possible. And, some of my good friends and closest working colleagues are some very conservative Republicans. And we work together enormously well, for example, on NASA issues, science and transportation issues. That work goes on all the time. Right now, I'm working with two conservative Republicans on the January 6th Select Committee, Liz Cheney and Adam Kinzinger. And so that work does go on. It's enormously important.
Yep.
I think the key is mutual respect.
Last question for you. You've been in Congress 20 years, and I wonder, some people were wondering where you're headed next or what your next step might be. Some thought maybe it was California Attorney General. But what is your plan? What is the Congressman Adam Schiff next chapter?
Well, I'm running for re-election, and we're all going through redistricting and wondering what our districts are going to look like. In terms of the future beyond that, my father once told me, if you're good at what you do, there will always be a demand for you. So I'm just going to try to focus on being good at what I do and let the future take care of itself.
You know, that's good parenting advice. I'm going to have to try that one myself. Congressman Adam Schiff, always a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
All righty. We're good. We're good. We made it through another show, folks. Woohoo.
30 seconds.
A little switching around off the top there because, you know, we always try to offer you 2 or 3 guests depending on the conversation. And sometimes we need to just tap dance a little bit because sometimes a guest is running late, one is early, one can't make it, or, you know, so there always changes. But we just roll with it.
9, 8, 7, 6, 5 seconds. 4, 3, 2, 1.
Thank you so much for joining us on this interactive show, Getting Answers. We'll be here every weekday at 3 on air and on live stream answering your questions. See you tomorrow.